This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I have one of those behind-the-scenes guests today, Ken Kocienda. Ken was on the ground floor right there in Apple's heyday, the golden age of Steve Jobs, directly responsible for the innovations, the insights that allow us to use, for example, the keyboard on our iPhone. Ken's background is amazingly not expected. A liberal arts guy. And in his work, he really explains that symbiotic relationship between software and product development for those that have never even thought about programming a computer. It's one of those behind-the-scenes accounts where you just say, wow, how cool that Apple pulled everything off. And even further, you can't help but say, even with all the positive things said so far, wow, Steve Jobs was an amazing guy. I really enjoyed this conversation with Ken Kocienda, talking his new book, Creative Selection, Inside Apple's Design Process During the Golden Age of Steve Jobs. I hope to have him on again, but to start, please enjoy our first conversation. So I was thinking, in preparation of this conversation, I literally went back to Wikipedia and I'm trying to figure out what was the exact first Apple model that I had. And I think 1990, it was either an LC or a Classic. I've never owned a PC. I'm a very, very biased interviewer for this conversation today. Never purchased one PC in my life.
Well, as an Apple enthusiast and a former Apple employee, I'm glad to hear that your biases run as they do.
I was thinking, though, back to the early 90s for me, as an Apple owner, a Mac owner back then, boy, I used to catch some flack. It was like, oh, you've got a toy. Isn't that cute? Look at the graphical interface, da-da-da-da-da. And it was always this kind of snarky, snide, but that's not a real computer. That's not real technology. What you really need is this DOS screen. And I just chuckle now because it seems so like yesterday that the tech intelligentsia was DOS, 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 DOS. Boy, how times have flipped, huh?
Yeah, things really change. The technology does go through these periods where the accepted level of a professional tool changes. I think that, well, it's clear that before DOS and PCs became the accepted norm, before that, you needed a room-sized computer. Those lab technicians with the white jackets in the air-conditioned room with the raised floor, keeping those big pieces of iron running, were looking at those desktop machines and saying, what are you going to do with that? It's a toy. Personal computer. What are you talking about? Perhaps a simple way to sum it up would be maybe Moore's Law, but I think it's more than that. It's what people can get out of the machines and what design, the development side, it gives people as a tool. As the quality of the tools get better, what people can do with them begins to seem more toy-like.
I guess it's not surprising given to what we as outsiders know about Steve Jobs, but I can feel it in your voice already. And I think one of the themes of this conversation is the bridging, and this gets back to kind of making fun of DOS, but under Steve, Apple, it was the bridging of the liberal arts with the tech. And I can see that in your background too. Your background is not a guy that was sitting there like Bill Gates at 13, just coding pure code. You were living an interesting life in a lot of different things, and then you made your way to Apple.
Yeah, I didn't come to technology through any direct means. My only college degree is in history. I thought that I was maybe going to be a professor and teach the liberal arts. But then I also had this real love of photography. My parents had a darkroom in my house from the earliest age. I remember them developing pictures. They always had cameras. When I got older and in college, I also spent a lot of time in the art program and a lot of time in the darkroom myself. It was right at that point where, in order to do really high quality photography, you needed to use the old style chemistry. Digital cameras were just coming along. But again, I mean, going right along with along the same vein is those first digital cameras were toys. And now, of course, things are entirely different. So I had these different interests, but neither of them were in the direction of technology. It was history and photography and art. And then after I got out of college, I went to Japan and became interested in learning about different cultures elsewhere. I photographed a lot. I spent some time teaching English in Japan and took all of that experience with me back to the United States and entered a Master of Fine Arts program for photography. But then there was a single night when I was in that art program where I was taking this elective where we were looking at what we could do with computers and photography. And the professor showed me the World Wide Web the first time.
What year? 93, 4?
Yeah, it must have been 1994, late 94. And so at that time, Yahoo was one of the first websites that he showed, but it was text only. If I'm not getting the dates exactly right, we could probably go back in the archive and see, when did Yahoo still have just a text only directory? And that's what I saw. And yet it was the most amazing thing. I went home from school that night and I told my wife, I said, "Hun, I just saw the most amazing thing, and it's called the World Wide Web." And soon after that, I decided I needed to get this in my life myself. So I actually went down to an ISP. I had to go down in person to an ISP, an internet service provider. I wandered into the office and eventually got somebody's attention, who then directed me to a fellow who was sitting in a cube, and I watched him open up a terminal window and type on the command line to add my account for dial-up. Went home and got a modem, and so it just goes to show how far we've come in a pretty short time, where the internet wasn't on all the time. When I wanted to dial up this terrific new thing, the World Wide Web, I had to dial the phone, dial the modem, and connect to this ISP that was across town in order to get these 14.4 speeds, kilobytes per second, and these web pages would take such a long time to load. Which again is just perhaps it's a long way of saying that I'm old, but it is another way of saying that it wasn't really that long ago where everything we take for granted today about the tech world wasn't quite there yet. You just kind of join that up with this other conversation about my background. Once I saw that, I went in steps to figure out, how do I get photographs showing up on the web, and then how do I make websites, and then programming for websites, databases and websites, and just one thing after another, I was doing programming.
My programming background started, and it never really went past web pages, but I hired a Russian programmer to put together my first website, 4 pages of static HTML, 1996, 21-year-old Russian programmer, $4,000. He built me my 4 pages of static HTML with a couple images. He then proceeded to disappear. I then had to figure out, how do I edit that code that I can't read? How can I make changes without breaking it? That was my reverse engineering process.
Well, it turns out that in my experience, that exact strategy was one of my best ways to learn new things. You start with something that works, that you don't understand, and you start tinkering with it, saying, well, if I poke it like this, if I poke the input this way, how does that change the output, right? And then you try to join up. If the output then doesn't look right, you try to go back to the input and figure out, well, how could that result How could that change that I made on the input side produce that result on the output side? And then repeat again and again and again. I mean, there's no real magic to learning how to do something new, and I've found that throughout my career, learning and implementing tech, even at Apple.
Curiosity, probably the number one thing, right? You have to be curious about how it works. I can change this. I can tweak this. It keeps working. Oh, I can do this. I can make a better change. Boom, boom, boom.
Yeah, I mean, you have to want it. You have to want to figure it out and know how to do it. You know, try to explain to yourself how the technology works. And really, it is things like HTML and things like programming, even in C or C++ or Objective-C or even Swift now, the Apple language of the day. All of these things are logical at their core. They're learnable, but you got to want it.
Let me get you to a terribly interesting book. I must say, I love the first person narrative. I don't know how you saved all these recollections to put it together and really kind of make me feel like I was there beside you watching this unfold. Quite fascinating, really. I mean, a great historical piece with timeless lessons for us. You've got an interview. You're going to Apple. It's a big deal. There's been a lot of success already. Put the date for me, put that interview, describe that opening day, that opening meeting, and then getting the acceptance.
Yeah, this was in 2001. I had worked at a series of startups before that, and none of them had been successful. And so I was looking to Apple as a safe haven, even though 2001, when I was interviewing, this was the late spring of 2001. So May, April or May. At that time, Apple had not even yet released the iPod. So the Mac was Apple's main product still. But as we were talking about earlier, with the dominance of Microsoft in everybody's mind and in the market. So Apple had a 5% market share. And so we think of today as Apple as this tech titan, but back then it was an underdog. And yet, still, to me, in comparison, it seemed like this stable company that had products. And Steve had, by that time, he had returned to the company probably about 4 years earlier, and had managed to turn the company around, and it was profitable. So Apple looked like an attractive option to me. So this interview, I was really nervous because Apple seemed to me to be a real company. And I had always loved Apple products from the moment that I saw them. My first experience with Apple computers was when I went to college in 1984. I went to college in the fall of 1984, and the Mac had been released in January of that year. Going to Apple was like, well, it was the big time. It was a famous company. It was much more nerve-wracking to interview there as compared to these startups. So I met a fellow there. His name was Scott Forstall. And at that time, he was a middle manager and was leading the team that was responsible for the user interface frameworks for Mac OS X, the new operating system that replaced the classic Mac operating system. To give some of your listeners some sense of what that means, if you're not a programmer or technologist, this was the high-level software, the software that put the windows and buttons on the screen. It was the software that, in order to make it, you needed to work with the designers who would be designing the graphics and the animations and the look and feel of the system. So I was at that first engineering level underneath the designers, helping them implement and make the system usable and implement the features that would make the Mac intuitive and pleasant to use. So it was really nerve-wracking because I really wanted the chance to make a difference on these products that I had liked for so long.
And you did not know at that moment in time, I don't think there was any press or PR about it. You said pre-iPod. So you had no knowledge of the iPod about to come onto the scene.
No. And after that interview, I was hired, thankfully, and my job right away was to make Apple a web browser. Because at that point, Microsoft Internet Explorer was the default web browser for the Mac, and Apple wanted a web browser of its own. I was hired to do that along with one other fellow. That was our secret. And Apple is a company of many secrets and was so even back then in June of 2001, finally, when I joined. And so the iPod was released in October of that year, and I found out about it that morning. Steve had scheduled an event to announce something on campus. There was a press event that was videoed for the world to see, but then that was also broadcast on a closed circuit in the campus. And so there I was sitting in the cafe, which the tables had been pushed to the side and a little theater made, and I was watching on a big screen, and I thought it was amazing. 1,000 songs in your pocket. It was amazing. I dashed right back to my office from that event, and I ordered one immediately. Actually, if I just reach over here, I'm actually holding that very first iPod in my hand right now. I have it. I have it on my desk as just as a remembrance of that product that set Apple on the course to become a personal technology company, to transform it from a computer company to really the next level, where people out in the world are going to be using Apple products that they don't think of as computers.
Tell me if I'm wrong the way I'm going to state this, but the success of the iPod was like venture capital, but without the constraints. Meaning the iPod's success was the real capital base that then allowed, and we're going to have to kind of compress time here a little bit in the essence of time, but the success of the iPod was the cash cow that allowed the iPhone to take place. Was that the real source of the revenue coming in, or do I have that wrong?
No, I think you've got that right. And it was a base of resources. It provided this base of resources beyond money. The money was important, of course, because then it gives the executives latitude to try things. Yeah, you can then perhaps take a chance on something in the future without maybe running the company out of business. And of course, back in those times, people were still saying that Apple was doomed, beleaguered.
Let me interject one thing here, though. Big picture, a cash cow appears. A ton of money comes rolling in. Corporate America sees this publicly traded company. I mean, it took a lot of huevos to go ahead and not just be like Microsoft, to literally take all this money and then say, not only did we just give you the iPod, we're going to take the iPod, add a phone, add a computer, and come up with something that you can't even imagine. I mean, that took a lot of gumption.
Part of it was Steve's vision for the company, that he wanted Apple to be relevant to people's lives, in people's lives, to give people products that were meaningful and useful to them. The iPod was this step. Now, music was in your pocket. Okay, that's pretty special because, I do, perhaps you do. I know most of the people in my family, circle of family and friends, music is a really important part of their lives. And so to have this wonderful part of what makes life worth living, what helps to connect things, maybe make you feel better when you've had a down day, put on a great song. And so that was wonderful. And so again, I mean, that was yet another part of this dynamic that Steve saw about how products in people's lives could give them these experiences that they didn't have before. Then the example also of the iPod as this pocketable device, and the knowledge and experience of manufacturing the products in their millions, developing the supply chain, developing the planning. The iPod in all of these ways was this springboard to the product that came next, the iPhone. And a tremendous amount of learning and self-education happened. And of course, then Steve was bold enough to take the chance, as you were saying, to apply some of these resources then and take a risk on, to parlay, kind of go double or nothing.
Steve announced the iPhone January 2007. So when did you know about it? When did the company put it in motion?
There was an effort that went on for some time, probably in the late 2003, 2004 timeframe. And I don't really know because there are other people who were involved in this and I wasn't yet. But the key technology that they were looking back in those earliest days that I just mentioned was multi-touch. What could you do to track multiple fingers and have the fingers become the input device to take the keyboard and mouse, put it aside, take the click wheel from the iPod, set that aside. So now you're going to be touching the content on the screen with your fingers. And so that was really a research and development project. Now, where I came in was just slightly after some others who then were told, yes, go make a product. We're going to commit to this in a pretty big way. And that we're going to try to make a whole touchscreen operating system, not just a demo, not just something that is a proof of concept more in the R&D setting, but we're going to try to make a product. And so when I joined, it was July of 2005, just about a year and a half before Steve was up on stage holding up an iPhone showing the world. I joined the team, and by that point, there were about 6 or 8 other software engineers and probably about 8 or 10 software designers. And again, like I described before, we were joining to make that top level of software, put the buttons on the screen, make the animations, give people the design, the interaction models that would make the touchscreen operating system work.
And what's so amazing about what you just said there, the buttons on the screen. Now, maybe young people, a lot of millennials won't recall, but buttons, little clicky chiclet type buttons, this was the BlackBerry. This was life for everyone. I mean, this was a huge innovation to go to the touchscreen.
Yeah, and this part of this is, well, all of us who are working on the software team had our own struggles in this area. My own struggle was to make the software keyboard. And what you describe about the BlackBerry and it being the model for everyone was really, it came to be the biggest challenge for me during that iPhone project was I had to make a keyboard in software, not in hardware. The iPhone was never going to have a keyboard like the BlackBerry. There were no designs to make the little chiclet plastic keys. The keyboard was always going to be in software. And the key aspect to that, sort of pun there, was that the keyboard could get out of the way. If it was in software, it could slide off the bottom of the screen. Thereby, when you weren't typing, that screen real estate could be made available for apps. And so you could play a full screen game. You could look at more email in your list, right? You can see a full screen photo. And so it really opened up the potential of the device to be something new and different.
Can I interject one point here too? And I don't know the exact timing of his statement, but just to put this in context about how revolutionary the project that you were working on, in particular the keyboard, you had billionaires, world-renowned billionaires, the heads of companies, guys like Steve Ballmer, who were pretty much making fun of the idea of this, that this could never be a tool for serious business people.
It's true. It's hard when you're shown something new and different, particularly if you have a psychological, an emotional, a financial, a corporate investment in the status quo.
How did you feel at the moment, though? Here you are, you're a relatively young guy. You're in the middle of creating a software-based keyboard for a touchscreen phone. You then can read the papers and read the magazines like everyone else. How was the enthusiasm kept inside Apple to where you could be so excited that this was going to happen and that you were going to top the thing that was out there that was making billions of dollars for BlackBerry? Was that enthusiasm kept inside on such, frankly, an R&D project at the moment?
We believed in it. We believed in Steve. Important part about the way that we made the iPhone is while we were developing it, we were using it to the extent possible. Now, for a long time during that year and a half, from June of 2005, when I started to when Steve was holding one up on stage, when he did, and when people could buy one, you could put it in your pocket. For most of the time, we had this whole kit of hardware laid out on our desk, and we had these prototype touchscreens that needed a tether, a wired umbilical to this whole other hardware to make the touchscreen work. While we were working on the software, there were other teams, secreted away from us, working on the hardware to miniaturize everything and to get all of those components small enough so that you could put it in this small case. And so it was this challenge that had multiple levels to it. There were parallel tracks, and we had our challenges in software to make the touchscreen work. But there were similar challenges, which again, I don't have much insight into, but I know that they existed to get the hardware working. And all of us, we just believed in it. We had faith that if we just kept going, we were seeing the steady progress. So we just kept going.
I think it was your second demo with Steve, I believe, and this is for the keyboard. Can you set that stage? I mean, look, we can't describe it exactly as you do in the book, and the book is fabulous for laying that scene out. I felt like I was there. I'm not trying to directly sell you books, but I really felt like I was there with that scene of you on the demo for the keyboard and setting it all up. So here you're a guy that you've been working on this for a long time, and there's a whole process for how you will then present to Steve. Why don't you set that up to the best that you can?
Showing work to Steve was a critical aspect to our whole process because getting his approval was necessary. He was involved. He was involved in a way that's different than I think a lot of people picture in their minds. Steve did not write code. He didn't design graphics. Yeah, maybe he knew how to use Photoshop, but he certainly didn't produce designs by himself. What Steve was an editor. He created the assignments and then gave them out to his staff, eventually to people like me, an individual engineer writing code. Then he evaluated the work that came back. And how it came back was we had what I like to think of as a pyramid of demos. So whenever I did a little bit of work, I would create a demo, so a prototype, something that somebody could try that showed an idea that I had for a new software feature. I'd say maybe even use the keyboard as the example. So I made an improvement to the way that keyboard autocorrection worked. In order for that idea to move ahead, I had to put it in a demo that people could try. And first of all, the fellow in the next office would try it. He would give me feedback, and if he liked it, hey, maybe we'd move on. But a lot of times, most of the time, there was, a response. Maybe it could work better if you changed this or that or the other thing. Maybe there was a complaint about performance. Maybe the software didn't work fast enough. Maybe it worked well, but not fast enough. There was a bit laggy. But then from there, this process went on. So we had many of these individual, one person showing another person in the next office a demo. And once we got to a high enough level of polish at that level, it went up to the next level. We showed a manager of our mutual manager. Then it would go to that manager's manager. Now, we didn't have a lot of levels. There were only about 3 or 4 levels always between me and Steve. But eventually, it would get shown to the fellow that I mentioned earlier, Scott Forstall, who at this point, kind of fast forwarding from that interview in the first day in 2001, by 2005, he was put in charge by Steve to be the executive running the development of the iPhone operating system. So I'd show the work to him, and I needed to get his approval. And the approval of the other people on his staff, software engineering manager and the design manager, and then they would approve to show to Steve. And these were pretty formal, very, very tightly organized, orchestrated demonstrations to Steve. Because one of the aspects of showing to Steve was he didn't want even a tiny fraction of the description that I'm giving to you now. When he saw work, we had to show it to him almost like it was a product lying on a table in an Apple retail store, and he was a customer walking in from out of the blue without knowing a thing about it. He wanted to pick up the product and look at it and try it and see if he could figure it out without an engineer like me telling him about every nuance and every detail. He wanted the work to describe itself. And so then the last thing I'd say about Steve right now is that he could be really intimidating. If he didn't like that experience that I'm describing, he came in and looked at this work. If he thought it was not up to standard, he would say so. Yeah, he could be kind of scary because his approval was so important. His taste mattered. His vision for the company and for the products mattered. For me, in order to get my work out into a product, it had to get through Steve and had to pass those rigorous standards that he held out.
I love this one line that I jotted down from your work. The demo was my question. Steve's response was the answer.
Yeah, that's how it was. He was like the great oracle. You would go to him as a supplicant bringing your question. And his answer was the word of the company. Now, there's another really interesting aspect of it. His word in the moment held, but he might change his mind, even sitting right there. Sometimes he would say a sentence, well, I don't really like that thing. Wait a minute, maybe I do. Because, again, when you're exposed to new work, sometimes things just hit you. And it takes sometimes a few seconds, sometimes a few minutes. Sometimes he would completely shoot down a demo one week and then come back the next week and say, I want to see that thing I shot down last week again because I've been thinking about it all this week and I can't get it out of my mind. There's something there that we need to explore. His vision drove a lot, and his vision was kind of like an example for the rest of us. We tried to, at each level down further in that demo pyramid, try to use his example in our demos. Try to be as rigorous and to have as high standards and to be as open to new work, but then also expect our teammates to give their best.
What I've loved about your work is that with so many movies about Steve, so many books, and look, the public, at kind of this 35,000-foot view, loves the tales of drama, the mercurial guy that might have been mean to someone or said something nasty. And I'm sure these things are true. And I'm sure there's probably ways, even in hindsight, maybe he wishes he could have said or done something differently. But what I always have thought to myself, why are we so fixated on those things? They've got to be the tiny elements overall. And I think your book lays out where the real detail was, the real genius was. Okay, no one's perfect. No human is perfect. We can say Steve got mad at people. Steve had a temper, whatever. But those things seem minor by comparison for the overall effort. I do find it interesting after all these years, people still fixate on some of those things, whereas I find where you've put the focus is so much more important.
Yes, Steve was focused on the products. That's what he cared about. He cared about making great products. The whole personal side of his life was something that he didn't bring to the office, but he did have an unwillingness to let social graces get in the way of efficiently pursuing the goal of doing the best possible work. One more little bit of color that I can add to the way these Steve demos happened is that they were very small. And getting invited to show a demo to Steve, involved a kind of a vetting process. When it came to software, Scott Forstall had to really give you the nod in order to get invited in to show Steve. And part of that was the belief that you had a thick enough skin that you could bear up under the pressure, and that you would be able to help make the products better right in the moment, that you'd be able to think on your feet. If Steve challenged you, which he did for me multiple times, he would ask you a question and then stare at you, expecting your answer. And if you gave a good answer, that was a really excellent way of getting invited back for the next demo. Giving a poor answer or freezing, maybe really smart people kind of begged off of demoing to Steve because they just didn't like the particular dynamic that Steve demanded.
It was a test in a way.
It was a test to see if you could help make the products better in the moment. For me, getting that experience of spending time with Steve and seeing how he looked at products, how he thought about products, how he thought about them, watching the thought process happen. When I would put a demo out for him, this keyboard demo that you mentioned before, when we turned on the screen and he turned his attention to the keyboard, he looked at it for, it must have been, 30, 45 seconds without saying a word. And then he did this unusual thing, which I'm not even sure what it was, but I can speculate. He looked at the work straight on, and then he turned his head in like little figure eights. And it's almost like he was trying to see the screen in his peripheral vision. How would it change? He just had this unique vision and this completely individual approach to the work. And to me, it was inspiring in the moment and has been all these years later.
You mentioned also about that particular moment that he was completely present. Now, completely present for somebody who has spent a lot of time in a Buddhist country is kind of a buzzword. It's like a blinking light. I don't necessarily know if it's a blinking light for all of us Americans, but completely present is a real tell sign. Why don't you explore that a little bit more, what you meant?
He could concentrate and focus on just one thing. It was really just remarkable to see, because this demo, that day, when I was brought into the demo room, he was actually talking on the phone when I was brought in. They had come to the, presumably had come to the end of the previous demo, and either Steve dialed the phone or received a call, and he just decided to take it. So they brought me in, and he was still on the phone. Even though there were a small group of us sitting there, 5 other people, 6 with Steve in the room, Steve was totally focused on his phone call. It's like we weren't even there. I mean, it was a kind of uncomfortable, because there he is talking to, some important executive somewhere, presumably, just given what we could overhear. But you're trying not to overhear because you don't want to be eavesdropping on the guy. But he didn't seem to care. And then when his phone call was done, he puts his iPhone back in his pocket, because this was actually a demo for the iPad, so the iPhone was actually already out by that point. So he puts his iPhone back in his pocket, and he swivels in his office chair, and he turns to me, and it was like I was the only guy in the world. It was intimidating, but in a particular way, in that Steve had there's kind of this legend about Steve that he could tell you anything and make you believe it. And there's the funny little name that people call it, the reality distortion field. Steve could make you believe anything that he wanted, because he just through this sheer strength of his personality. And yet, when he looked at me, it was like he flipped the switch on that. He reversed the polarity on this reality distortion field. And I got the feeling that there's no way I would be able to pull the wool over his eyes, even if I tried. Such was his focus. It was like he just banished all flummery. If you were a bag of wind, you would never make it through a Steve demo. You had to be, or try to be, as focused and on point as he was.
This is a great moment for a pivot, because everything you're describing is one instance, your situation, one aspect of the iPhone. But you lay out in your work this kind of what you call this evolutionary design model, this kind of Darwinian process that you guys kind of, pulled together. You call it creative selection, kind of all this about incremental improvement. So even though you describe this one experience, this demo with the keyboard, we have to imagine, outsiders, and I guess you on the inside too, this was going on all the time, nonstop, improvement never stopping, in all aspects of the device, the iPhone. And Steve is the maestro doing this all the time.
Yeah, it was the culture, this culture of never really being satisfied, never being done with the work, always able and willing to go back and try again. And so just a few words on this creative selection idea, this evolutionary design model. And it begins with a couple important ideas. Number one is, when you have some notion, you get a dream, an inspiration to create something. We found that it wasn't enough to just step up to a whiteboard and maybe sketch it out and talk about ideas in the abstract. We didn't really do that very much. Instead, I would go back to my desk and I'd write a program and load it onto a prototype piece of hardware and then put it in your hands, give you something you can try that embodies that idea. And I tell you, those first efforts, those first prototypes were terrible almost all the time. And yet they did manage to show something, some aspect, some kernel of the idea. And that was the jumping off point. We would start there to then figure out ways to improve that demo. What could we do to make it better from where it was? Is it perfect now? No. Okay. Then what are we going to change about it to make it better? And then, again, kind of this demo pyramid, get this feedback, gather up these responses, and then go make the next demo. Start with that first one, make the second one, try again, do another demo. Through this incremental process, round after round after round of refinement, that then stepped up to the managers, the executives, and then to Steve himself, we evolved great products from these humble beginnings.
The way you describe the culture, so different than your peers. Now, when you're inside and that culture is evolving and developing, this evolutionary culture, all this experience building on top of one prior experience, did you guys all know how different that was than all the other firms in Silicon Valley? Or how was that thought of inside the company?
It really was an embodiment of Steve's approach. He wanted to see demos. That's what he wanted. As a result, we developed this way to produce demos on a regular basis. That's kind of it. I mean, it's not like there was ever any deep realization that this was going to give us the results that we were looking for. It was really more a matter of Steve's asking to see demos. What do we do? Every Monday, he's going to want to come in and get a look at the latest software. So we need to make new stuff. As I think back on those times, it's like we engineered and designed our process at the same time that we were engineering, designing the products.
And then, of course, you've got the feedback from customers coming in too. And then you've got feedback from success. And then that starts to build as well in terms of the direction that you might continue to go.
Yeah, it ties into this aspect that you raised before about the iPod, this seed fund, this internal venture capital dynamic where you simply base what comes next on what's come before. I think that it was just a very pragmatic approach. We didn't think too much theoretically about what we were doing. It was all a matter of, okay, well, the iPod's successful. What comes next? Boy, we've learned a lot from it. And hey, boy, there's this multi-touch thing. And wow, batteries are getting better, and so are CPUs and GPUs. What interesting software might we be able to write? Yeah, just one thing leads to another. Whereas I think Steve had a vision, and I think that others of us, like me, tried to follow in his tracks. It was really more a matter of looking at the work in front of us, rather really than worrying about, is my vision up to Steve's caliber? It's really more a matter of, how can I improve this demo that I've got in front of me right now, and just keep doing that day after day. And that actually proves to be a pretty effective way of creating that vision, creating those wonderful results that you're looking for.
The audience will have to go take a read, but you described 7 elements to Apple's software success. You mentioned 1, inspiration, collaboration, craft, diligence, decisiveness, taste, and empathy. The 3 that I find interesting: craft, taste, and empathy. Again, back to my opening salvo with a liberal arts education. Those are not things that your typical kind of guy on the spectrum programmer at 13 would ever think about: craft, taste, and empathy. That is a completely outside the tech perspective.
We used certainly the word craft quite a bit. We thought about the care that we were putting into the work. I describe craft as using skill to achieve high quality results and always striving to do better. As a person writing code and working very closely with designers, I would sometimes sit there with the designer, and we'd look at an animation that maybe lasted 0.3 of a second. Well, would 0.298 be better? And we would try it. And what about 0.250? Let's make a big move, right? 50 milliseconds was considered a big move. And we would try these. We would hone in from 250 to 300 milliseconds and maybe decide on one of those ends or something in the middle. But it was a matter of just iterating and trying and applying a craft person's approach to creating these digital objects.
I think you might know, maybe you're going to read my mind and see where I'm going from your work, but this chase for perfection, the craft, the perfection, you tie in something that people might not expect, which is the power sweep. And for those football fans that might not recall it, it's a little before my time too, actually a little before your time, but Vince Lombardi. So Vince Lombardi and putting together a web browser. Tie that in for people as we wind our time down.
I watched a lot of sports growing up, and you're right. Vince Lombardi is a little bit before my time. History is a big part of my background. I learned about him, and I learned about the way the Green Bay Packers played football in the 1960s and the way that Vince Lombardi turned around the Packers from a team that was mediocre at best for a dozen years or more. And within a couple of years, he turned them into a championship caliber team. And the way that he did it was he focused them. He told them, look, fellows, we've got one play that we're going to run, and we're going to run it again and again and again and again. We're going to hone this play and refine it. We're going to perfect it. So much so that when other teams know it's coming, the defense and the other teams knows that the offense of the Green Bay Packers is going to run the power sweep, that they're not going to be able to stop it. And this sort of goes against some notions of, right, Sun Tzu, right, all warfare is based on deception. And, offenses and defenses in sports are often modeled on that. But Lombardi said, no, if we can execute this play well enough, other teams won't be able to stop it, even though they know it's coming. And the aspect that I took away from that was the focus on one thing. And so how that relates to a web browser is that when I joined Apple, Steve Jobs gave me and one other fellow, and then eventually a couple of other people joined us, this mission to make a web browser for Apple. And he said he wanted it to be fast. And his idea was, well, Apple already had a web browser, Microsoft Internet Explorer. And if we're going to replace it with a new Apple browser, we're going to be taking an existing product away from people, giving them something new. Well, we're going to have to give them a reason to change, a reason to feel good about this new program that we're going to give them. So he challenged us. He said, I want you to make this new Apple browser way faster, much, much faster than Microsoft Internet Explorer. So go. Now, this is, again, an interesting insight of the way that Steve worked. What he said to us at the beginning of our web browser project was very similar to what Vince Lombardi told his football team. Hey, look, we've got one thing that we're going to focus on, and this is going to be the linchpin of our success. Building on that Lombardi example, that Steve Jobs example, we worked for over a year to just refine and hone the speed, this performance of our software. And by time we were done with Safari, it was 3 times faster than Internet Explorer. That achievement, I think, is a worthy one. It's good. But the key takeaway for me is that it was on purpose. It wasn't just luck. It wasn't just that it was a feature that turned out better than we expected. That speed of that web browser tied all the way back to that initial vision, that initial challenge, that statement from Steve, make the browser fast, just like Vince Lombardi told his football team.
I could sit here and pick your mind for hours. And I actually almost want to challenge you. It's like, yes, you've put down this book, but you could lay down your own podcast. You could literally, or I could interview you for hours and hours and weeks. Now, you're not going to do that, but it is one of those things where it's so much fun, and at least for me, to really kind of dive through your world, the world of Apple, and to kind of live vicariously through the experience and learn something, right? That's the whole goal here. What can we learn from yourself, from being at Apple, from Steve? Now that he's not here, what can we all take away and hopefully apply to our own lives, our own businesses into the future? And what can we do better? Because, again, as I started this conversation off with talk of DOS and stuff, there was a period of time, my gosh, what would have happened and what would have been the development of technology if Steve did not appear on the scene? I tend to think over time, a lot of these, graphical user interface advancements would have happened, but would it have been at the same speed? Would big monopolies have kept us in DOS forever? What would have happened, right?
Yeah, you never know. There are no guarantees to how things are going to work out. There's a whole lot of luck and just serendipity. And Steve was here, and now he's gone. But he had a wonderful effect and set an example for how to make great work that through my book I've tried to relate, because I got a little bit of a closer look at it than probably most, if not all, of your listeners. Now that period is passing into history, I thought it would be a good idea to give voice to it and to show and tell a little bit about what those times were like.
Are there any companies or people beyond who is still at Apple that have really taken the Apple inspiration and gone those types of directions, at least from your perspective?
Well, it's interesting. I think that the culture of Apple continues. Things change, of course, and things evolve, and as they should. In some ways, it is maybe doing those companies that are really executing at a high level now, maybe even doing them a disservice to relate them back to Apple and Steve. What I'm looking for is people and companies coming up with new ideas and perhaps even new models for doing work that are going to make what we did at Apple seem like the Stone Age. I think we're all going to know it when we see it. I hope so.
Well, I got to tell you, as a guy who's done a podcast for 6 years, 700 episodes, if you could see my jerry-rigged situation for pulling a podcast together, I need the software engineering talent to tackle this scenario because it's not seamless to pull off a podcast yet. That's for sure.
It's also a matter of testament. Use what works.
Yeah, it's true.
And focus your attention where you think it's going to give you the most benefit.
Absolutely. I don't try to have any bells and whistles. I want to use what works, be efficient, and if it's the best that I've got right now, that's what I do. Ken, I appreciate you taking the time today. The book, Creative Selection: Inside Apple's Design Process During the Golden Age of Steve Jobs. Fantastic stuff. I appreciate you taking the time today. Where can we send people? Where can they go? What website? What Twitter handle?
My Twitter handle is my last name. That's Kocienda. If you want the book, you can go to your favorite book vendor and type in Creative Selection, 2 words. If you want to go directly to my website, it's creativeselection.io.
Ken, I appreciate you taking the time again. Fantastic stuff. Very cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.